We are starting. So session is on inflation. Our speakers include Hasan Comert from Trinity College, a UMass grad we're very proud of, CP Chandrasekhar and Jayati Ghosh from UMass, and Ozlem Onaran, who's online, I hope.
Yes.
Luckily, she's
Yes, you. Yay.
so she's the third speaker, so we have plenty of time to make sure that she gets on. So our first speaker will be Hasan, structural differences in inflation dynamics in developing and advanced countries and policy implications. You have 20 minutes. I'll give you a signal at 5, 2, and 1 based on Jake, and we'll stick to the time. Thank you very much.
Go back into it. Sorry.
First of all, it's great to be back to UMass and Perry. I graduated from here in 2011, and from time to time I came back. And thanks for organizing. Thank you, Bob and Jerry, for organizing this, and thank you for coming to listening to this conference. So today I will talk about structural inflation dynamics in developing countries in relation to advanced countries. I will try to talk about some policy implications. And as we know, inflation, and basically this has been the fact and then reported by many, right? Inflation has been applications for income inequality, for political stability, and monetary policy, especially in developing countries. As Bob this morning spoke about Chilean case, inflation can be very, very dangerous for programs as well. For example, nowadays, Venezuelan case can be also another important, country case where inflation has been an important problem, which has had significant implications for aggressive policies as well. So after a long-term declining trend, inflation has been on rise in many, parts of the world. And is it a permanent reversal, or is it just a sort of transitory reversal? We don't know yet. Simply, we don't know. But we all know that central banks and all researchers, macroeconomists, microeconomists have started allocating a lot of time, as we do here. And this study focuses on the inflation dynamics in developing countries, and we pay special attention to the differences and similarities between developing and advanced countries. And we will highlight the main trends we will benefit from, especially inflationary trends and drivers of inflation after 1970s, while we are building the story of this presentation. And our focal point will be CPI rather than many other inflation measures. And depending on how we understand what happened after the 1970s, basically, and depending on how we understand structural differences between countries, we can develop different theories, and we can basically develop different policies to address and to understand current developments. And this presentation will be on more descriptive statistics, but in the background, I will use several of my previous papers, and I will also rely on previous research of other researchers. I mean, look at, it is very clear that this well-known fact that inflation in the world, right? And this was a sort of inflation stabilization at a low level was achieved in advanced countries in the 1980s, and developing countries achieved relatively, stable and low inflation around mid-1990s. And both inflation has been declining. Then this is not only, income group developments, this has been the case for different income groups, but at the same time, inflation has been declining in different regions as well. Basically, we can speak about a globalization or synchronization of inflation in advanced and developing countries. So that is the basically overall structural development since late 1970s, or we can call it, we can start from 1980s as well. So you look at, for example, inflation correlation between different regions, it has been increasing, and at the same time, it has been very, very low. So there is, very, very clear-cut synchronization or stabilization of inflation among almost all income countries, among all regions in the world. So the same thing is true for regions. And overall, indeed, I'm not the first one who documented this, and you can find just many authors documenting this. But the bottom line is there seems to be some sort of structural forces, or globalization trends in inflation. So indeed, several researchers have already reported these structural forces. For them, and based on my own research, basically upward and downward movements are mostly related to oil prices, global food prices, exchange rates, global demand. You can just call it global growth. Directly or indirectly, this trend is also increasing trade and financial integration. So here, I will focus on a couple of key factors which have been driving this trend, and I would like to also highlight the importance of these factors for developing countries and the implication of these trends for developing countries. First, energy and food prices are very, very important for developing countries. So it is also important in advanced countries, but you cannot miss the importance of this for its class, for an upper middle income, for a lower income developing country. So when you look at, for example, this graph, the share of the expenditures in consumer budget in developing countries make up around 40–50% overall consumer basket, relative to, for example, about 10% in Germany and some around 10 or about percent of consumers' budget in advanced countries. It is so different, and then we need to basically understand this difference, able to make some policy conclusions and to make some inference about inflation dynamics. So then, it is not only about the importance of food and energy prices, but price elasticity of these prices in countries is very, very low, which means that when prices of these goods are rising, consumers cannot respond to this development. So there is an inelastic, basically, demand price still of these goods. So look at this, for example, it is relatively low. And when you basically go up to developed countries, you will find a large price elasticity. High correlation between energy, food inflation, and inflation in developing countries. When you look at this, if there is, food and energy prices are very, very important for developing countries, then we expect that the role of these items, inflation in developing countries, should be high. Indeed, this is what we see here. This is simple as Bob suggested this morning. Of course, this is not causality, we know this, but overall, this missed. So it is, increasing correlation between energy, food inflation and overall CPI inflation in developing countries. So indeed, based on our case study, which we concluded this study 2018, but unfortunately we were not able to publish the political reasons because one of my co-authors at that time was working at Turkish Central Bank. Anyway, I would not go that detail, But overall, we are working on this again. So what we see here, high contribution of energy-related items to CPI in inflation in Turkey. So overall, about 50% of Turkish CPI inflation is related to food and alcoholic beverages, plus housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels. So basically, these are related to food and energy prices. So about 50% of Turkish inflation on average has been related to these two items. So it is so crucial. And if these two items are actually in determining inflation in developing countries, then it is very easy to establish the next step, the volatility of inflation in developing countries, right? Because in general, energy and food prices are very, very volatile in developing countries. So inflation and food inflation, they are so volatile, which means that they can contribute to a disinflationary period, or they can contribute to a very, very high inflationary period in developing countries. So it can work both ways. So highlight later on the role of exchange rate. So another important integral part of inflation in developing countries is the pass-through, the inflation related to exchange rate. Since exchange rates are very, very volatile, then it is very easy to establish the fact that inflation in developing countries has been very, very volatile relative to advanced countries. So, but then the next step is to try to understand the implications of this for different income groups. Because if energy prices are very important for developing countries, and if at the same time, we know that income inequality is very large in developing countries, then what we will expect is the fact that there is a high chance that poor people in developing countries are exposed to inflationary shocks more than advanced. So indeed, energy-related items make up large portion of even medium consumers' expenditures. Developing countries tend to have relatively higher income inequality. And at best, as a result of this, if everything goes well and food and energy prices are going down, maybe it would create a sort of machine for poor people. But since volatility of prices are very, very apparent, they are very, very exposed to inflation and price change in prices in food and energy. So we look at the Turkish case, and then we basically calculated inflation of the poorest groups and inflation of the richest quintile. And the difference is significantly positive and high. I mean, on average, during this time period, the inflation was about 7%, and the inflation between poor and rich people was on average about 2%, right, more or less, about 1.5. So it is something which we cannot ignore. So during this time, inflation was in Turkey, but when you look at how different income groups experienced inflation in Turkey, it's obvious that Turkish poor, low-income groups experienced higher inflation in Turkey. Of course, I mean, when inflation prices and energy prices go down, most likely this trend will be reversed. But overall, there has been a positive difference between poor income inflation and inflation of rich groups. So we basically documented this for different quintiles as well. And as you expected, as we expected, the main contributors are food and non-alcoholic beverages and housing, electricity, gas, and other fuels. So overall, on average, these two are positively contributing to high inflation of poor groups. When you look at other items are not making that difference. In fact, they are decreasing the difference between rich and poor income groups inflation. So the last but not least, exchange rates are crucial. Another important determinants of inflation in developing countries. Indeed, many studies reported this, like Howe and Macaulay, and recently we did this for the Turkish case in 2016 et al. This is IMF, which is very, very large study conducted in 2019. They reported similar things over there. And just I'm borrowing this from et al. And then we have similar graphs. I guess their graph is a bit better than our current graph. That's why I'm just borrowing from them. So we are working on it, and then I guess we will develop slightly different presentation. So here, advanced country economies and correlation between exchange rate. Okay, it's sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And we can even speak about a sort of insignificance of exchange rate for advanced countries. But when it comes to developing countries, the role of exchange rate has been positive and relatively high relative to advanced countries. So in 2016, we reported this case for the Turkish economy. And then basically we found that apart from inflation persistency, this is world commodity price inflation. And this line is showing exchange rate. Exchange rate and world commodity prices are two main contributors of Turkish inflation. So then we are also establishing the importance of exchange rates for the general developing countries and for a case study of Turkey. If this is the case, so if the major source of inflation are related with factors which are generally beyond what monetary policy can easily influence, because what we have reported so far is the fact that exchange rates, food prices, inflation, energy prices, energy inflation are the sources of mainly inflation in countries. If these are the source of inflation, central banks in developing countries cannot affect these factors. These are structural factors. And then this means that they need to find a way to decrease inflation. There are inflation targets, right? Because remember, many developing countries became inflation targets, which means they have to do something for it. At least they have to pretend to be doing something. What we found was the fact that they are asymmetrically responding to exchange rate developments, which means since they cannot directly affect inflation by using the interest rate policy by affecting demand, because inflation is not demand driven, there are structural forces, global forces over there, they are trying to benefit from exchange rate appreciation trends, which means they have asymmetric response to appreciation and depreciation trends. When depreciation takes place, they try to respond to this by increasing the interest rates. This is basically the response of, this is our study which we conducted in 2019 for IT and non-IT countries. And using augmented nonlinear reaction function, what we found was the fact that is they are not, let me check. Yep, so responding is one alpha 3, that is basically appreciation trend, but they are responding to depreciation trend. And then they are basically also having a sort of nonlinear threshold over there. They are responding to exchange rate about 2%. I have 2 minutes. Right. So again, we look at the Turkish case because that's what I guess, focusing on first developing advanced country differences, then going back to Turkey and then checking what's happening in Turkey. We reported this case. This is from 2016 Cambridge Journal of Economics paper of us. And then we found that basically the Turkish central response to interest rate, this is inflation, they are trying to increase the interest rate. When there's a depreciation, they don't wait for appreciation. Okay. Given this, basically, I guess we can highlight some important conclusions. Structural global trends shaping inflation dynamics, both in developing and advanced countries. So inflation has become more a function of global forces throughout time. And inflation is not a monetary phenomena, as this morning one of our friends highlighted. Apart from exchange rate dynamics in developing countries, it is more about structural forces, which is beyond what monetary policy can achieve. And developing countries are much more vulnerable to global developing countries. And this is basically, as many of us, I guess, agree upon, imported inflation and disinflation. And under current conditions, central banks, especially developing countries, may not have a meaningful impact on inflation. Inflation can decrease or increase, but they cannot directly affect this. They can affect this by hoping that they can exchange. So then what are the possible implications of this? I will highlight just this, and then I will start. So long-term strategies, strategic integration, both trade and financial laws are here important in determining inflation. So it's not about inflation, it's about general policy structure of developing countries, which can also address inflationary pressure. So inflation issue cannot be addressed without addressing other important problems in developing countries. Aiming at more stable international monetary policy system, prioritizing energy and food security. I have also some short-term policy solutions, but I will stop in order to not to take anybody's.
Right on time.
Thank you very much for inviting me and organizing this really very timely and very interesting conference. It's great to be back at UMass Paris, albeit online, and apologies that I couldn't make it in person. Yesterday I was teaching, on Monday there's a hiring panel, and thanks for the opportunity. I will talk about the British context, and I'm very happy that you located the British case in the session on developing economies. That's how it feels like when one lives and works here. I'll briefly mention the trends in wages to put it into context in terms of inequalities, in terms of the wage share, wealth inequality, both since the Great Recession, but also the long term. Then briefly mention the first and second wave of inflation and its drivers since 2021, and talk about the dilemmas of the policy response by the government and the Bank of England and their limitations. And hopefully in the spirit of this conference, I'll end by discussing what is to be done by proposing a green, purple, red New Deal that's going to build on some of the econometric research we have been doing at Greenwich, with also former UMass alumni, Jem Oywatt, among other colleagues. And I will particularly highlight one finding out of this research that's about wealth taxation. This is, of course, about funding a green, purple, red New Deal answer to the inflation crisis, but it's also about tackling inflation itself by taxing wealth, one of the drivers of inflation. So in terms of the big picture, of course, this crisis is part of a multiple dimensions of crises, ranging from the climate crisis to the care crisis, multiple inequalities in the age of a new phase in technological change, and on top of it, the political crisis with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The pandemic itself temporarily looked like it was delivering a divergence from neoliberal dogmas, and it did actually open space to rethink the role of public policy, public investment, particularly in key sectors, but that has ended very swiftly, at least in Britain, not so much maybe in the rest of Europe, to the extent that it did end in Britain with what we now call austerity version 2. So in terms of the big picture, obviously the squeeze in workers' wages is not new. Wages fell after the Great Recession, and the years of austerity that followed the Great Recession deepened the attack on wages. Ever since the Great Recession, nominal wages have been failing to catch up with the rise in prices year after year. Real wages of many workers in Britain are still lower than what they were before. And this crisis, of course, is coming on top of decades of undervalued wages, particularly of those so-called key workers in the key economy and other public services, and the squeeze in wages by an unleashed capital thanks to neoliberal mode of globalization, financialization, and last but not least, attack on trade unions. This is, of course, coupled with an increase in household debt, who have been struggling to make ends meet, and this is a particular vulnerability in Britain as much as in the USA. So the cost of living crisis is not something new, but its current scale is the deepest in a generation. Inflation has hit 11% here. Nominal wage increases, if you include bonuses, are increasing at a rate of 6% as of September data, and this is less than inflation, obviously. If you exclude bonuses, regular pay is increasing at a slower pace than that. And there is a gap between the rate of increase in the private sector versus the public sector. Regular pay in the public sector increased by a mere 2.2% as of today compared to a year ago. There are sectoral differences, obviously related to the labor shortages that has been discussed in the previous panel. Wholesale, retail, hotels are experiencing slightly higher rate of increase, but still on average that's falling way below inflation. So we can't repeat it enough in this conference, I suppose. There is no wage inflation spiral. That is a very different situation to 1970s. The shape of Phillips curve looks very different today. Much lower unemployment rates are leading to much more moderate nominal pay increases. Obviously, we are seeing a deterioration in working conditions with more 0 hours contracts, dodgy self-employment practices, much weaker unions. And overall, where we are today, what we are seeing in Britain over the next 2 years is an expected decline in household disposable income by 7% in real terms. That's basically wiping out 8 years of developments in income. And the crisis doesn't mean the same for all workers. There are very different gendered effects. Women are at the front line of the cost of living crisis. They're doing still more than 2/3 of the domestic unpaid care work. And that means they are carrying a higher burden of the struggle to meet ends meet, the difficult choices between eating and heating. And women also constitute a larger proportion of the most vulnerable workers at the lower end of the distribution with more precarious contracts. They constitute the majority of the workers in the public sector, in the care economy, who have already suffered from pay freezes and very dismal increases afterwards in the past decade. And this has been the case now, even after the pandemic, despite the fact that all the policymakers went out to show off clapping the so-called key workers in the care economy. Women are more likely to struggle to pay the debts and the energy bills, or they're in areas in terms of tax payments. And on top of it now, of course, with the health crisis after the pandemic, with people having to drop out of the labor market, women are the ones who have to care for these workers, and they are, although perfectly fit and ready to work, they're themselves dropping out of the labor market too. So within this context, of course, we have had the first wave of inflation. I'm not going to talk in length about it because that has been covered by the previous speakers. This first wave has been pushed by imported input costs. Maybe something that needs to be emphasized in the British context is the effect that comes through Brexit that adds on top of the other supply chain disruptions. It's something that we haven't mentioned maybe so far enough is the effect of climate change disasters on food prices. And on top of it comes Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and all that is being worsened by commodity price speculation. Now, on top of that comes the second wave. The second wave is usually discussed as if it's a US phenomenon. It isn't. It is very much a European phenomenon and very British as well. So we have been observing increasing profit margins. Of course, that's not new. Markups have been increasing before the pandemic as well. But after the pandemic, there's a new round of profit-driven profit price spiral, as you have discussed before. Schnabel, an ECB policymaker, says this is particularly evident in sectors most heavily exposed to global conditions, such as the industry, as well as the agricultural sector. That's not just limited to energy or basic materials sectors. It is a story of large export-oriented multinationals benefiting the most. This, though, signals to policymakers that it would be possible to increase wages to avoid a cost of living squeeze on workers without causing higher inflation if profit margins, markups could be decreased in some industries or in these large profiteering firms. Having said that, firm heterogeneity is a big issue as well. There is a big diversity across firms, heavily indebted zombie firms, small and medium enterprises who are themselves being squeezed by increasing rents as well as input costs and energy prices. So if you look at listed companies, even the ones who are publicly listed companies, the number of companies issuing profit margins have increased in the third quarter of 2022. Here is a glimpse of this story. This is from a recent report by two think tanks in Britain, data from 2022 June of the non-financial publicly listed companies in Britain, comparing the profit margin after the pandemic, the last most recent reporting, with the pre-pandemic 2017-19 average profit margin. And you see how much it has increased in the maybe top 10% of the companies, where you see the company with the largest increase in profit margin is increased by 60 percentage point compared to pre-pandemic average. Whereas on the lower end, there is the opposite, with companies even who have faced a 45 percentage point decrease in profit margin. If we had had more time and data for the full 2022, we could be today presenting what has happened to markups of all the companies, both listed and unlisted companies in Britain. What explains that? It's not just about market power, it's also about financialization in terms of our gut feeling. It's about the balance of power relations within the firm, bargaining power of workers versus market power of firms. But that paper will have to wait another year, I'm afraid. So that's a glimpse of what is to come when we have more data and analysis. Moving on maybe to 4 lessons from the fiscal and monetary policy responses in Britain and their limitations and disaster they have created. Obviously, the first is a common issue across the world. Certain these policy responses fail to deal with the causes of inflation, which has been driven by increasing imported input costs and increasing markups of large companies rather than demand or wage price spiral type of inflation. So the current actions of Bank of England increasing the interest rate doesn't cure that type of inflation. It doesn't help with the rising cost of gas or oil or rising cost of profit margins, but it causes a recession and a rise in unemployment or even higher numbers of insecure jobs, with still less effect on inflation after decades of changes in labor market regulations and fall in labor's bargaining power. Despite this fact, Bank of England's governor said workers have to moderate their wage demands. And there is very little reference to the context that I started with about a decade of squeezing wages on top of another 3 decades of neoliberal squeezing wages. There is now some discussion in Britain that inflation has already peaked and Bank of England has a risk of overkill by continuing further increases in inflation interest rate. Having said that, obviously, these are not normal times because obviously interest rate is still in real terms negative and it's not clear how much inflation will come down given the uncertainty about the war in Ukraine. The second limitation is a more British political soap opera. This is a small island in the developing part of the world. I don't know how much it made its way across the Atlantic, but the lack of coordination between monetary and fiscal policy became quite phenomenal in Britain. At the end of September, when the new Conservative Prime Minister Truss announced their new so-called mini budget, which included very regressive tax cuts for the rich, which implied increasing borrowing to meet certain policies to help the households through the energy price increases, in a way what you could brand as a right-wing version of the modern monetary theory. Markets reacted actually quite swiftly and strongly by saying this will not stimulate the economy. This fetish of the old school Thatcherite, low tax supply side economics and the implied trickle down neoliberalism is not really the answer. And at the same
5 minutes.
Okay,
5 minutes.
at the same time, that coincided with the Bank of England being really very clear about their quantitative tightening policy at the same time of the announcement of the September right-wing MMT version of fiscal policy. Obviously, that had very unexpected consequences that they had no idea about. And I have to say with some humility, we also had no idea about. That had a very deep effect on UK pension funds, particularly defined benefit pension funds, who had been engaged in these very creative so-called hedging activities, the liability-driven investment activities. That led to a high amount of margin calls from banks because pension funds were borrowing from banks to invest in high-risk, high-return speculative assets, which led to a fall in the price of bonds further, an increase in yields, which forced, of course, the Bank of England to a U-turn, which also, though I have to say, led to a U-turn by the government. But I think the big lesson is that the central bank is being given conflicting targets in terms of targeting low inflation as well as financial stability, and in a country with financial complexity in the non-bank financial institutions, along with indebted households and firms. All these are actually creating also systemic risks and spillover effects on banks. We haven't seen that so far, but I'm leaving that as a question mark. So on top of that came the government fiscal policy response, austerity version 2. That will be, of course, self-defeating. It relies on a myth of a fiscal black hole that doesn't exist. And even asset fund managers today are saying look, you're driving the wrong lessons from our response to the previous September conservative budget. We didn't ask for austerity. These are their own words in a letter they wrote to the Financial Times. We want policy gradualism, not austerity. So do we have an answer? What is to be done? Well, yes, we do. We, of course, in the short run have to do all we can to reverse the squeeze in wages, but at the same time arrest inflation. The answer to that is price controls in terms of energy, rent, and I include to that essential food items. I'm not going to go into details of that because we don't have time. We need to talk about regulations such that we tame the increase in markup rates. We have to talk about linking household debt payments to income, as well as a ban on disconnections in terms of energy supply. We need to talk about the global dimension of that in the way of debt restructuring. And we need to talk about the mandate of the Bank of England, which is at the moment in Britain, narrowly targeting inflation. That has to include a dual target with a larger weight on full employment target. And in the medium run, the answer will come from what we call a green, caring, just transition, the green and purple and red New Deal. How to fund this, to tip into the toolbox of policies, using all tools in the toolkit. Of course, we know public spending in the green and care economy will be partly self-financing. There is money, multipliers are very high. Of course, borrowing in the short run will be necessary. There are other policies like using national investment and regional investment banks and cooperative banks, as well as using monetary policy itself to fund this investment, and using progressive taxation of not just income, but wealth. I'm going to end by talking about progressive taxation of wealth. This is important also to time wealth-driven increase in demand that drives inflation. And while doing that, we have to go beyond the limited talk about a windfall tax or increasing tax rates on just dividends or capital gains. That actually is something that stimulates the economy as it comes from our macro work. And I'm going to just end maybe by 1 minute with this proposal of a progressive net wealth tax targeting the top 1% in Britain, starting with a high threshold of top 1% households whose net wealth in Britain today is about £3.4 million. We say let's start taxing them at 1%, and let's gradually increase it for the top 0.5% and 0.1% of the households. So this model could rise, depending on how much you allow for tax avoidance and evasion, could increase about 9 to 16% of current total tax revenues in Britain. So the conclusion is it is possible to have a green, purple, red New Deal. And I think I will have to skip all of this, but leave you by saying we need to combine all these policies together with productivity-oriented wage policies, stabilizing effective demand while correcting the past losses, and embedding all that in a democratic participatory plan in the medium run. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Ozlem. Okay, so do we have the slides all set now? Jayati, Ghosh, and CP Chandrasekhar. Yeah, we got it. Yeah, you have to, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to dispense with all the other preliminaries. I'm just going to start and then Chandra is going to take over. So basically the context for the low and middle income countries, I now hesitate to call them developing because God knows what is going on. But the point is that there were very stark differences in COVID. We're very delighted to be following Hasan and Ozlem, but particularly Hasan, because a lot of what we're saying really is complementary and adds to some of the things that he mentioned. But in the recent period during the pandemic, basically out of about 14 trillion additional fiscal spending, the US spent more than half, and just 10 advanced economies spent more than 80%. So the rest of the world, 86% of the world's population, we got the remainder. And so very, very different fiscal stances. And of course, those have got even worse during the Ukraine war because we have been forced to be prudent for fear of capital flight. And this has not just harmed the recovery, it's also actually harmed citizens, less social protection, less ability to provide minimum social policies and all of that. So what's holding us back is partly external debt, partly it's IMF conditions for those countries who have it, but also very much the fear of credit rating downgrades and capital flight. And of course, all this is now made much worse by the recent monetary tightening in the advanced economies. And that has caused massive capital outflows from the developing world, even when we've been all fiscally prudent and been very good and so on. You know, it hasn't helped us. We're still getting capital outflows. So now, of course, most LMICs are facing this kind of perfect storm of debt problems, stagnant economies with greater poverty, falling employment, lower money wages, not real wages. Money wages are lower than they were pre-pandemic in many of our countries, including India. And of course, climate change, which was already mentioned. Basically, we got stagflation well before it was recognized. This is just showing once again the difference in fiscal stance. Most LMICs have spent less than we did after the global financial crisis, although it's a much bigger crisis at the present. Also, we have much greater informality. We have 70% on average informal workers. In some countries like India, it's 90%. So we're much less able to give social protection, even though we actually had worse lockdowns, longer periods of closure, and so on during COVID. So that's the context. And then, of course, we have all the big increases in food and fuel prices. I want to emphasize a point made in the morning about it being sectoral. Food and fuel prices in particular, prices have been major drivers of inflation in developing countries. It's cost pushed not because of wages. We are not looking at wages as the cost. It's cost push because fuel is a universal intermediate, which is an imported intermediate in many countries. And food also in many countries is imported, but anyway, now everybody is affected by the global food price, whether they like it or not. And as you can see, they increased dramatically in the period, well, beginning mid-2021, but specifically after the Ukraine war. However, and I really want to emphasize this point, we all fall for it. It's not supply. It was never supply even during the war. And I want to emphasize this point, in Europe, gas supplies did not go down between January and July 2022. Gas supplies remained the same. What they didn't get from Russia, they got from India, from Russia. Okay, so it is never supply. It was not supply throughout this period. Both food and fuel, there is no evidence of any change in global supply. It is entirely profiteering and a financial speculation. And as you can see, in the world wheat price, we're back to where we were pre-Ukraine. So there was this big period of massive increase in prices, but just like happened during the global food crisis of 2007 to 2009, in fact, it was nothing to do with global supply or demand-supply imbalance. It was entirely driven by profiteering of large companies in food and fuel and financial speculation in the commodities market. The problem is that in the developing world, LMICs, whatever, we still face higher prices. In other words, it's gone down globally, the global food price, for example, but also oil prices. Everything's back to where it was pre-pandemic, but we are still facing higher prices. Remember that we already had a big food crisis pre-pandemic, okay? These are the proportion of the population that cannot afford what the FAO calls the minimum nutritious diet, minimum. So in India, we're only at 70%, can't afford it. But some countries in Africa, as you can see, are between 80 and 100%. I mean, very, very high proportions of the population could not afford the minimum nutritious diet before the big recent price increases. But that's why it's not just a cost of living crisis, it's really a cost of life crisis. Why? Because our food prices and fuel prices tend to be sticky downwards, but especially food prices. Even when the global price comes down, ours do not come down to the same extent. This is, the left side is maize, the blue is the global trade price. And as you can see, it went up, came down again. But you don't find two major importing countries for maize, Ghana and Guatemala, both of which are currently also facing external debt crises. And you do not find the same price decline. Price, once again, Bangladesh, a rice producing country, but also impacted by global trade. Sri Lanka, well, is of course facing a debt crisis, but as you see, the global trade price barely shifts very much, actually falls over this period, but the domestic price of rice increases dramatically. Now, what happened? Why is this? It's because more and more countries were basically opened up to global trade, including in agricultural commodities. Export orientation means that you actually become net food importers, you export cash crops, or even if you're not, your prices are hugely influenced by global prices, no matter what happens to domestic supply. And many countries now find that when the global price goes up, you really don't have many options. You can't really deal with it anymore. But the worst, if you like, outcome is because of the open capital accounts and the liberalized capital flows, which have led significant external debt, both public and private, which has now become a burden. But they've also made vulnerable to volatile capital flows, which is something that Hasan talked about. And that creates constraints on domestic policy space, and then it has impacts on exchange rates. So the basic point is that we can respond to some extent. We can try and respond to food and fuel price increases. For example, in India, there was a ban on wheat exports, which was heavily criticized by WTO, G7, everybody. They said, how dare you, even though, as I said, 70% cannot afford the minimum diet. But nonetheless, you can do that. You can try and use domestic supply measures, price controls, and so on to some extent. But you can't really do that in terms of the impact of the capital movements. And how does that work? It works because capital outflows generate depreciations, and those depreciations then have that push effect on all other prices domestically. And especially if you're an oil importer, well, that's sort of accentuating and highlighting the effects. So Chandru is going to talk about capital flows.
Okay, now, so where we are at is, well, as has been mentioned, we have imported inflation in particular of energy and food prices. But we can manage it to a certain extent in countries which are large, which have domestic policy space, like India. Countries don't have domestic policy space because of the degree to which over many rounds of IMF financing, they've actually become completely void of a state which is in a position to be able to take any action which sort of protects them from these kinds of imported effects. But the thing is, it's not merely the fact that there is global inflation. If you take the average inflation in many low and middle income countries, and you sort of rank countries by it, you would actually find that today inflation rates are still not where it is in some of the advanced economies, because of the fact that in some of these larger ones, in particular, it's been possible for the state to try and deal with this imported inflation and manage exchange rates to a certain extent because of large accumulation of foreign exchange reserves, which the central bank then deploys to prevent depreciation of the currency, which would actually sort of aggravate inflation. In India, for example, partly because, of course, of movements of relative exchange rate, let's say the euro and yen and the dollar, you've had a situation where, even taking that into account, you had more than $100 billion is the decline since the beginning of this calendar year in the total foreign exchange reserves, because the Reserve Bank of India intervened in markets to try and manage excessive depreciation of the Indian rupee, which of course would have translated into inflation. But it's not just that. Look at emerging markets in general. We had 3 periods in which, as a result of the transition which occurred, the rise in finance in terms of actually opening up a capital account, we had a period from 85 to 95. That's balance payments manual 6. So negative means an inflow of capital. That's the new convention which is followed. And we've had 3 surges, one surge between 85 and 95, one surge 2001 to 2007, partly between years when actually well before the getting liquidity into the system. Then liquidity in the system. So we have a spike after 2009. And then of course you have COVID, but central banks in the advanced even more liquidity in the system. And therefore you have an even larger inflow into some of these countries, because some countries didn't manage to get it because of the fact that by then they'd already got too indebted. Now, as a result of that, if you look at accumulated capital, this is the legacy capital. That is basically taking the net in a year, that is net, and saying that, okay, all of this is stocked up in equity and bond markets in these countries. You can see the huge amount of legacy capital which is actually moved in these countries. And if you have that magnitude of legacy capital, it has 2 kinds of effects. One kind of effect, of course, it has is it's deflation, because of the fact that the ability of the domestic state to adopt proactive policy doesn't exist anymore, because of the fact that you're constantly looking to see how foreign investors are going to respond. In most cases, you switch on television and you move to business news, and they'd be saying, this country has got too high a fiscal deficit and something has to be done about it. So you actually have a broad deflationary stance. But on the other hand, what you have is, because in some of these countries, the inflow of liquidity and the accumulation of legacy capital has been so high, you have these credit fuel booms. So in a significant number of emerging markets between 2003 until the global financial crisis, you had a boom which is fundamentally financed by debt to capital. So you have the contrary effect, but a contrary effect which actually now makes you completely prone to boom bust, because of the fact that you're creating this large amount of putting large amount of debt into the system, because there's this inflow of capital. That capital obviously buys into domestic currencies to make its invest bond and equity markets. That increases the deposit base of the banking system. Banks don't have a choice. If the deposit base increases, they have to actually go out there and lend, and they are constantly finding newer and new areas to do it in some countries. So you have both kinds of effects. On the one hand, you have deflationary effect, and on the other hand, you have a tendency to have these boom bust cycles because of debt to financed speculative investments. Now, this is not true only of the more advanced emerging markets. It's actually even the poorer countries, including countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, some countries in Latin America, which are not Brazil's and so on. And in many of these cases, you actually had governments going in for sovereign bond issues. Suddenly, you seem to have access to because you can actually issue sovereign bonds, even though you're identified as the sphere market. So if you take, say 2019, you take Ghana, Kenya, and Benin, they together issued 6 billion bonds in that one single year. And to have these yield-hungry foreign investors who are getting money at 0% in their markets, moving into these frontier markets, making their investments, and obviously accumulating legacy capital here as well. Now, this obviously increases vulnerability hugely. Now, if you look at it, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but even IMF admits, the inflow of capital to these countries is not because merely of industrialization. It actually factors, and the supply side factors are, of course, US interest rates. Whatever happens, commodity prices, because of global factors. When interest rates are low and commodity prices rise, you actually see an inflow of capital because of a supply side. Now, if you have that, you have of effects, because is become extremely vulnerable to these, but the way in which economies respond to inflation, because of the fact some strange reason has been discussed in the whole this morning, monetary instruments become the crucial instruments. So you not only have monetary agency to a certain extent, but you also have an increase in interest rates. Of course, interest rates, there is a difference between today. It's not here. Even at that time, interest rates went to what, 20%? You're talking about a situation where not there. Why not there partly? Partly not there because of the fact that there's been this huge increase. Look at what has happened to the balance sheet of liquidity in the system. You're actually not talking about a need of that kind. You're talking about one where money has been picked up cheap and not only invested in middle income countries, but also in asset markets in the developed countries, including in equity markets. So you don't want a hard landing. You don't want to push up interest rates too much. So we're not talking about, this is not deja vu. This is not really era, but as far as the developing countries, it's not the debt crisis of that period, but high interest rates and debt crisis actually is because of this large accumulation of legacy capital that has two kinds of consequences. One, of course, in the poorer countries, we're having debt defaults. If you look at this is a borrowed graph from Gorin Shah's, if I pronounce it right. Well, you can look at that's the interest rate, the yellow line. And there are three types of crises we are looking at. This is in emerging markets, currency crisis, banking crisis, and defaults. And of course, you can see that particular, the blue, the currency crisis is quite significant and the defaults are quite significant every time interest rates go up. So in precisely a similar kind of situation, but a similar kind of situation which is different because of the fact that you've had this long period of accumulation of legacy capital, which has made you extremely vulnerable. Okay. Now, the other effect, of course, which has been mentioned, I'm going to go into that, is the impact it has on exchange rates because of the fact that if you actually are in a situation in which interest rates are rising, foreign investors who borrowed cheap, engaged in the carry trade, decide to book their profits and move back. That essentially results in a situation where not only do you have the larger current account deficits because of what's happening on the trade front, because of oil prices and prices, it also is because on the capital account, you're seeing an outflow, which results in that kind of depreciation, which aggravates the inflation problem. The indication of this, of course, is that in some sense, the problem in emerging markets is not just dealing with inflation, which is partly or significantly imported inflation in exchange rate depreciation driven. It also is actually to deal back both inflation as well as the adverse effects of the response of that to that inflation in the advanced economies in the form of monetary policy results in a situation in which you actually have a double whammy, which not merely gives you, as was mentioned, not merely gives you your own version of inflation, but it also gives you a medium-term deflationary stance because of legacy capital accumulation and an immediate crisis because of the fact that you see an outflow of capital or you're forced to default on your debt. Now, if that is the case, then what you're saying is, when we say that, what should be the policy response? I mean, that's the question which is being posed. What is to be done is not merely to deal with inflation. As I said, there are some countries deal with inflation to a certain extent and have lower levels of inflation than the advanced economies because of the fact that they went in for controls of one kind or another, use their reserves, manage their exchange rates. Really, what you need to deal with is the fact that openness in a double sense on the trade and capital account fronts, but particularly on the capital account front, is a major problem which has to be addressed. That's not a short way of dealing with inflation, imported or otherwise, but it is the only way in which you can build resilience to deal with what is a tendency towards global or synchronized global inflation, as it was pointed out. Now, the only difficulty is that in all of these years, what is being prescribed to developing countries is that it is even when the IMF began to admit that, listen, open capital accounts are becoming a problem for many of these countries. What you had recovery option, which is called macroprudential measures. That is, you don't go for capital controls. You go in for prudential intervention, which is to try and deal with currency volatility, which actually is trying to prevent speculation in during periods of currency depreciation, maybe in So that can become the victims of these bonds.
So our discussant is James Heintz from UMass, actually the chair of the department, and managed to find minutes among his other heavy responsibilities. So do you want to go up? Okay.
I don't know whether the people online will see. That
Well, we
camera-
we can't hear if it's not to the proper mic.
Yeah, so.
I don't know what's the problem.
That's right.
I'm charging this. Yeah, I don't think I'm going to need the 20 minutes. So I've been doing their job for so long. I think I've kind of forgotten how to be a discussant at a conference. So let's see how this goes. So looking just listening to Chandru, Jayati, and presentations, I was actually reminded of some early work that Jayati did with Sheldon on inflation targeting, the impact of inflation targeting, and concerns about that. And some of the arguments at that time, specifically from Latin American structuralist macro economists, really focused on the real exchange rate and the impact on the real exchange. Which involved, I mean, the argument was with inflation targeting, you had to keep interest rates high, which would attract capital flows, which would lead to an overvalued exchange rate, that would affect the productive capacity of these different countries. And so in the presentations, there was discussion of the exchange rate and the fact that depreciations tend to lead to inflation, and appreciations are a way of controlling that inflation. But the impact of the real exchange rate and on the productive capacity in the current time period where global trade has really been disrupted by the crisis, it's now just trying to reconstitute itself. I wanted to hear some reflections on that. So we do, I mean, there is pass-through between the nominal exchange rate and inflation. If that pass-through is 100%, if it's perfect pass-through, you're defining the real exchange rate as the nominal rate times the relative price ratios of the trading partners. 100% is not going to affect the real exchange rate at all. There's kind of perfect nominal adjustment in terms of the real exchange rate. But Hasan showed us some correlations. They're high correlations, but they're not one. You know, they're less than that. And there's an asymmetric policy response to appreciations and depreciations, which makes me think that there can't be perfect nominal adjustment to the real exchange rate. There's going to be impacts on the real exchange rate. Those impacts are going to affect how, you know, the disruption to supply chains and so on constitute themselves, with direct impact on developing economies. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that. Kind of related to the real exchange rate issue, but a little bit different. Just listening to the morning sessions and the current session, you know, a lot of the causes of inflation that people have, prices, profiteering in the disrupted global supply chains and so on, locate the sources of the current inflation in what we would call the tradable sector. These are kind of, you know, tradable sources of inflation. And presentations state that, you know, inflation itself is becoming more globalized. It's being located in tradable sectors more and more going forward. Of the policy response, I mean, I think of a lot of the policy responses in terms of contractionary monetary policy, really about restraining demand, and that's going to have a disproportionate impact on the non-tradable sectors, not necessarily the tradable sectors. And Josh Bidden showed us, you know, that it's already had an impact on housing in the US, which is a large non-tradable seems like the policy response is trying to deal with non-tradable sources of inflation
seems to be tradable sources of inflation. So this has, also impacts on the allocation of resources in different productive sectors in both in the developed world, in the developing world. But it also raises a question whether kind of domestic monetary policies, when inflation is globalized at this stage, could be effective at actually controlling inflation. And, almost all the alternatives I've heard up to this point have been about domestic policy responses. But do we have to start thinking about global policy responses to inflation? We think about that. Is it kind of pie in the sky type of issues? Are there issues around cooperation and coordination of policy response? My next kind of comment, just to hear the panel's reaction to it, has to do kind of with the political economy under which monetary policy is being currently that inflation ultimately is the result of some type of distributive conflict somewhere in the economies. And in thinking back to the 2008 financial crisis, we had massive, monetary policy looked very different. We had quantitative easing. We weren't worried about excess liquidity. Trillions and trillions of dollars went into the financial markets, and there was no, questioning about any of that. And you would be like, well, there's no question, there wasn't any inflation at that time. I don't think that's correct. There's no inflation of goods and services, but there was massive inflation in prices and financial markets. But that's not part of the decision-making process of central banks. But in terms of the political economy, I think one reason why we didn't have a lot of questioning of the excess liquidity is that both non-financial and financial capital had a stake in rising asset prices at that stage and benefited both of them. So the current crisis coming out of COVID, that crisis was not did not begin in financial markets, again in the real economy. It was a disruption in the real economy. So I think the source of crisis and the policy response, I think we need to keep that in mind. The source of inflation here, if we take the profiteering argument into account, seems to be in the interest of the non-financial corporations. And policy response, in terms of trying to curb inflation, seems maybe the interest of financial interest and not non-financial. So we have a conflict between different actions of capital. So if we're thinking kind of about the broad political economy and capital's interests in the current situation and the strategies for proposing, solutions or alternatives to the inflation crisis, what do we have to take into account? That's my question for the panel, kind of that larger context. And the last bit is just a very specific comment on Ozlem's presentation. I learned a lot about inflation in Britain, and it was really, really helpful in the social impact that it had. And I know, Ozlem, you were like trying to fit so much into 20 minutes that you probably didn't get to all the connections. But I did not get the connection between the New Deal policies and kind of in inflation policy. I think of New Deal largely how they've been articulated is kind of increasing targeted to labor-intensive sectors that have some kind of social consequence to them. The Green New Deal, the Purple New Deal, care economy, and so on. And just an expenditure policy in the context of this discussion about inflation, I didn't understand the connections. It seems like there was a whole supply side story somehow missing there, how the investments in kind of renewables would in the long run help us control inflation, or in the care economy, seeing people as produce factors of production, not just consuming units, that it's a labor force for the next generation, has real supply side implications. I feel like there was something that I'm not connecting the inflation discussion to the New Deal discussion. Those are my comments. Very quick.
What? I have to say something. Does it work? Is it working? Okay, well, as I was just saying, we'll take 3 or 4 from the audience and then Eric will give us a summary of a few that are online. So those of you who are online, feel free to write to the chat and so who's wants to start off?
I'm Josh Mason from John Jay College, and before that from UMass. So I have a question that's in response to Hasan's presentation, and everybody up here. You talked about the exchange rate contribution to inflation. And I've got a couple of questions about it. First of all, you presented that as sort of a reason why monetary policy is not to be effective. But textbook story of the transmission of mechanism monetary policy tends to emphasize its effect on the exchange rates. In fact, you can find mainstream people saying that the primary way that central influence inflation is via the monetary policy. So it feels like there's maybe a missing piece of the story there. Second thing related to that I wanted to ask about is, naively, I think exchange rate inflation would not be correlated across countries because different patterns of trade, different exchange rates are moving in different ways, different moments. So it seems like an important part of the story might be the fact that we really live in a dollar standard world where trade is actually priced and invoiced in dollars, so that appreciation of the dollar is essentially everywhere. You don't actually have bilateral exchange rates in the short run. That would be an argument. So I'm curious if you think that's sort of an important piece of the story here, why inflation that is driven by exchange rates is so strong correlated across the world. And then the sort of further implication of that might be that we could expect interest rate increase in the US to be inflationary for the rest of the world, that by leading to a dollar appreciation, in effect, we're exporting.
Sure, and I'm a researcher at Perry. My question is to Professor CPC and Ghosh. You talk about the capital control. So one of the worry in the developing countries is if such an announcement is done of capital control, then it might lead to more capital outflows. Nowadays, the pension funds, like new in India, even pension funds as related now to the equity market. So how do we control that? Are we in a vicious cycle where it's very difficult for developing countries to come out of such measures of capital control without fearing an outflow? And actually, I had this discussion with you, but I still struggle to understand that how speculation can work any underlying demand-supply imbalance in the market. Prabhat has also been arguing this for quite some time, like about speculation is linked, eventually has to link with something like copper. There was a lot of speculative activity, but once China's demand fall in real market, then that activity also went up. So I'm just wondering whether it's possible to have speculative activities without any underlying demand-supply imbalance. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Gregor. I'm also here at UMass and at Perry. My question is based on Jayati's and Chandrasekhar's presentation about specifically about capital controls and the boom effect of foreign capital inflows. We talked a lot about climate change, a cause also in the future of more inflationary episodes. And international states now seem to mitigate climate change by building out giant capital, low carbon energy supply, and so on, with debt finance from the global north. And so my question is, how does that maybe relate to your so how would one say that capital controls the alternative way to build out these alternative structures around the world? Thank you.
Why don't we take one from her? We'll take some from Aaron. You don't have any?
I'm Marielle Cohane, a retired professor from MCLA. And I was interested in that Puerto Rican debt is owned by a private equity company. How much foreign debt from countries is owned by private equity? In the context of the Jewish movement of the 2000s, when restructuring of debt ended up making low-income countries owe even more than had before. Is there any hope for restructuring? What are the impediments? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more and then get responses.
Yeah, thank you for fantastic presentations. Price controls came up, and in my observation, price controls are most difficult to implement the more peripheral you are to the source of production or to the powerful players in the market. So if you take the example of the US, I think it would be pretty straightforward to do, for example, an oil price cap, because there's so much fossil fuel industry here. The US is even exporting and so on. So it would be relatively easy to kind of cut into these speculative hikes and cut into these profit hikes for one of the most important sectors. If you take the EU level, I think if the German government wasn't opposing that, it would have been feasible to do a gas price cap, which would have stabilized global gas markets, which would have probably benefited also developing countries are now like kind of being overbidden by countries like Germany with their fiscal power that kind of attract all the LNG that go elsewhere, right? So how do you think then about controls in the periphery at kind of the receiving end of all of this? I think to some extent, this question also goes to Ozlem for the UK, insofar as I understand that the energy price caps that the UK government implemented are all fiscally financed, and given that the fiscal space seems to be somewhat fragile, is this like, is it even the UK taxed straight out energy price cap for all energy consumption that is financed basically by subsidies? Thank you.
All right, so now we'll have responses, including responses to James's comments, starting with this. And then if we have time, we'll do a second round.
It's working. Okay. So thanks a lot for fantastic questions and comments, James and others. So I'll start with James' comments. And so James referring to competitive real exchange rate argument by some Latin American structuralists, in a way that when depreciation takes place, then it can, if there are one-to-one pass-through, it can basically increase, it's supposed to increase the export prices and increase import prices, then it can hopefully increase, decrease net deficit, trade deficit, which may improve exports, right? So to be honest, I am a bit skeptical. I have been always skeptic. I have been very, very pessimistic towards this argument, because I feel that basically it is not that easy. Price, in fact, many research show that. And of course, I know that like here, me and some others show different results as well. But I have also seen a lot of opposite results in a way that it's not that easy to compete against, against basically advanced countries or some other competitors based on prices, because this is assuming that you are trying to increase your competition based on price developments. But there are all other forces which will affect basically your ability to export higher than ability of imports, right? And actually, I'm not very optimistic about the effective competitive exchange rate impact of this depreciation. That will be my answer to your first point. Second, global responses, whether we have global policy responses. I guess when we look at history, there are three periods of this inflationary period, right? First, gold standard, 1870 to 1914. Second, 1945, 1970s. The third disinflationary period took place from 1980s to current, recent time period. So in all these three periods, in two of them, exchange rates like gold standards versus Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate. In these two, there were basically nominal anchor of exchange rates. So basically, it is the global monetary system which anchored the inflation in these two historical periods. In the last period, there were the forces, and then exchange rates have still played a role. But integration in China and many other forces played important roles in this inflationary period in the last period. So I feel that there is no automatic stabilizer of inflation in the last period, in the recent period. That's why I fully agree with you about the fact that without having this kind of global monetary system, disinflationary or inflationary periods will be always random unless we have a sort of stabilizer mechanism within the system, built in the system, which we don't have right now. The third one, inflation. So who is benefiting from inflation? So that's your class conflict, right, argument.
Or policy.
Yeah, policy response. So I can argue that for many developing countries right now, high inflation, that the source of high inflation is actually energy prices and food prices. Poor people have been disproportionately affected by this. So in a way, I can argue that right now it is very, very high time for Turkey and for developing countries to address this inflationary problem, because it is directly affecting the lives of poor people. It's not like a sort of maybe different periods inflation. That's why from that perspective, rich people are in a way that they can protect their wealth, etc. And poor people have been losing a lot. So in that sense, from class struggle perspective, in this case, inflation is working against at least the outcome. I know that I am not responding your reasoning part, but in terms of outcome, inflation has been basically against poor people at this moment, at least in developing countries. As for Josh's question about this textbook argument, Josh, you know better than me, right? That's trilemma and dilemma discussion, basically. So, because when you look at this textbook argument, when you increase the interest rates, it may increase financial inflows, which can basically improve exchange rates, which can decrease inflation, right? Anchor inflation. But this is textbook argument, and then this is assuming that basically financial flows are related to domestic interest rate policy, as rate 2015, as I try to show, as many others try to show. There is an emerging dilemma rather than trilemma, because that goes back to the argument of trilemma, which assumes that trilemma exists under flexible exchange rate regimes. You can implement independent monetary policy, which is not the case. So that's a macro. I didn't mention, but that is over there. So about right. Yeah, I will just stop here. Then I will come back to Josh's second point later on.
Okay, Ozlem, would you like to comment? Is she there?
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with the price control question, because this is short run, and then I'm going to move to the green purple New Deal, which is medium run. I mean, price controls is a emergency measure. If we say that workers don't have to pay for this crisis, we have to sort out the past losses in wages, match inflation on top of that. Then we need to do something about prices. And one short-run measure about prices is price controls. Now, what can be done about that? In the British context, the proposal of Progressive Economics Forum was to provide universal basic energy access up to a certain amount at a controlled, fixed, low, affordable price, and then let the market price be paid if you're consuming energy above that. And yes, this has to be fiscally funded. It's a short-run emergency measure, and this is why I'm getting at how will we fund this question. It requires borrowing, it requires the use of monetary policy coordinated with that fiscal policy in the same direction, while trying to look into the taxation of wealth. There is a lot of money. So I have learned my lessons from the failure of the September mini budget, right-wing modern monetary theory version of excessive borrowing type of budget. The way to deal with that is to have wealth taxation. And price controls for me is to include rent as well as essential food prices as well. But the burden of that on the fiscal side can only be dealt with in the medium run by growing your own. Hence comes my green purple New Deal idea. And growing your own means a massive amount of urgent, large scale, within the time of a government of 4 years, public investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency, public transport, organic plant-based sustainable food supply, and also social housing. So you can't control rents not outside the social housing sector forever. You have to grow the size of the social housing to deal with that. Care economy, why is it important here? Well, this is why I started by the long discussion on the gendered effect of cost of living crisis, but also saying the labor supply crisis is a care crisis as well. You have to expand health and social care, and in general, the care economy, well, such that people who choose to do so get back to health and can get back to work. And women who are the carers of those who can't work can get back to work if they choose to do so. And the next dimension of course, the care economy here is that it does stimulate productivity. The other way to deal with cost price spirals is to increase productivity. How do you increase productivity? It is about investment, both in physical investment, but also investment in what we call social infrastructure. And yes, I was trying to have time for a nice diagram that we had prepared before. Obviously, fiscal expansion of this huge scale would require, well, wealth taxation takes some of that money out of the cycle and deals with some of the inflationary pressure, but not all of it. And in the short run, surely fiscal expansion will have fiscal effects. And so far, we haven't given enough thought what it means for particularly certain inputs and their prices. If we are looking into the medium run of within 4 years, if you are having a massive investment in renewable energy, public transport, energy efficiency, housing, and the care economy all at the same time, surely we need to be conscious of the effects of that in the medium run on prices. Hence, price controls will have to be with us for another while. But productivity in some time at the end of that medium to long run, is also important, again, dealing with the price pressures, because an increase in transport investment, housing investment, energy investment, as well as care investment, surely improves productivity and does improve or moderate some of those inflationary pressures in the medium run. I thought these links between short run and medium run price controls versus green, purple, red New Deal was clear in this audience, but thanks, James, for the comment that gave me another 5 minutes to talk on that.
Okay, thank you. Jayati and Chandra.
Okay, I'm just going to take a couple of. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah. Yeah, first, I mean, this is not directly related. It's a question which came up, but which is on this political economy of monetary policy. What we do have is across countries now, including developing countries, there's one notion that you should have an independent central bank, that the central bank's policy has to be to target inflation. To target inflation, basically has to use its monetary levers. And in that, the most effective ostensibly is the interest rate. So this is there everywhere. Now, when this thing began, I suppose, I don't know where everybody places themselves, but I mean, some of us basically said this is because of the rise of finance, because I mean, it's finance capital that wants an independent central bank. And if finance capital wants an independent central bank, it then says that you shouldn't do certain things. You shouldn't have proactive fiscal policy. So we should ban any agreement between the ministries of finance and the central bank, which allows the minister of finance to pick up a phone and say, listen, I'm sending over some short-run treasury bills. Please transfer some money into my account. No borrowing from the central bank by the state. You go to the open market and borrow. The other idea was that, listen, you got to basically use your interest rate, and you should have an independent monetary policy committee, which actually sits down and decides the interest rate. That is, non-elected representatives will decide what's good, whether it's for prices or whether it's for output. Now, and all of this we said is because, in fact, a friend, which I'm sure is a friend of all of yours, Arturo O'Connell, who also, besides being this famous Argentinian economist who used to be in the Argentinian central bank, said it's the epistemic community of finance which decided that you needed this kind of a central banking and this kind of political economy of monetary policy, as it were. Now, I listening to Bob this morning, I just thought, okay, supposing we look at why would finance want high interest rates. At one point of time, we said it would want high interest rates because it believed that you could use that to control inflation, that just as much as low fiscal deficits control inflation, because rises in prices affect the real value of financial assets, because when goods and commodity services prices goes up, financial asset values go down. So that's why finance wants it. But as I was saying, we know now that that's not the world we are in. We are in a world in which huge amounts of liquidity infusion at near zero interest rates has been picked up and invested in asset markets across the world, in developed countries themselves and in developing countries. So in this context, if you suddenly begin to raise interest rates, you're going to completely, upset financial markets. So this wouldn't be a world in which you actually would want finance would want interest rates to be pushed up, given the fact that they are so overexposed to multiple financial markets. So maybe they got trapped in their own logic. Maybe you created these independent central bankers who can't think any other way. and somebody was saying that, we don't want austerities. I mean, Austin was saying, but it's too late. You put these guys in who believe there's only austerity. So this political economy of central banking, I thought I should mention. Two other things. One is the question about debt, private equity. Is it involved? Yes, in all countries. I mean, Blackstone is a major player. Every time there's a debt renegotiation, Blackstone arrives there. In Sri Lanka, we know that one of the private equity firms has filed a case in the UK saying that you can't have debt restructuring because I want every cent of my dollar back and I'm not going to, take a haircut. So they are major players. They are major players, including in some of the so-called frontier markets. The discovery of frontier markets was creating new alternative assets. So yes, and they're not willing to treat this as odious debt. They actually who represents exactly what as Vikram is saying, it represents exactly what the previous Rajapaksas were saying. But all those who say that you can't deal with these corrupt politicians, deal with the new prime minister. So they're there. Finally, just this question of blended finance. On this financing of this started with this ESG, this environment, social, and governance financing. And we know some of the top gurus, Tariq Franci, Stuart Kirks, all of these people saying this is rubbish now, that this is nothing. This is just a bunch of guys putting a label on these instruments and trying to make a huge amount of money. Similarly, the whole thing of finance taking over, this infrastructural investment, green financing, is essentially to say that whatever little monies the state puts in should be used to actually de-risk private investments. And we should oppose that. Because what we want, I mean, okay, we're not going to speak of reparations, but if you have any notion, and we're not saying that, major, emitters like China and India shouldn't contribute. But if you have a polluter pays principle, then it's necessary for those who put the most carbon into the skies to actually put the money out there in the form of grants as far as possible, if not concessional finance, because that's just justice. If you want climate justice, you need either concessional finance or grants. I mean, some debt will be there, but we can't make that the basis for financing activities where the rate of return is near zero or very low. Thanks.
Yeah. But no, we're going to go one round, and then Jamie, hi. And then
Jimmy's joined.
we'll have a next round. Okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
was that recognition for a question, or I couldn't quite hear?
Wait for Jayati's going to give her first response, and then
Okay.
after you.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for some terrific questions and truly excellent comments from James. Thanks. So, so I'm going to just try and address a few of them. I don't pretend to be able to even fill in all the gaps that because there's so many very big questions here. So Shobik, how can speculation work without any demand supply imbalance in a market? Unless you believe in the sort of, let's face it, very 100-year-old notion of Caldor that all speculation has to be stabilizing to be profitable. That it's always the case. I mean, what you're asking is a speculative bubble possible? And we know, unfortunately, that it is, right? You can get Dutch tulips, you can get crypto, you can get all kinds of speculative bubbles. In the same way, you can get a speculative bubble in a real sector, in a commodity sector, by creating, if you like, the sort of the noise around it. And it doesn't mean that it will last. That's the whole point about it. I mean, as I just showed you, the wheat price, it took 7 months to get back to where it was. In the meantime, some people made a lot of money. Same thing happens with a lot of stocks and shares. The same thing happened with oil prices. The same thing happened in 2007-9 with the global food prices. That you can get a very significant speculative bubble using a piece of news that everybody will say, oh, yes, of course. So you say, Ukraine war, supply shortages. And suddenly you can raise your food prices as much as you like. I mean, the big food multinationals have got 4 times their average profit in the last year. You can raise fuel prices because you say, oh my God, Russia's this big supplier of gas. The only sector where supply was affected is fertilizer. That's the only commodity for which supply was affected. None of the other things which were drummed up to be this huge supply thing was actually affected. Yes, there were supply constraints resulting from COVID and the supply chain issues. That's a different matter. But the major commodities, this was a pure speculative bubble. The problem is that it is short-lived in that global market, but it continues and persists in a lot of the importing countries for the reasons that we talked about. Okay, Josh, yes, absolutely, dollar-denominated trade. That's really the essence of it. Most commodity trade is still dollar-denominated. Of course, if the sanctions continue for longer, they will not be, which is a good thing, I would say, for a lot of countries. But, at the moment, that is a very critical part of the story. And I want to link, though, what you're saying about, this whole exchange rates and monetary policy with this very good point that James made about productive capacity. So here's the thing, you're absolutely right. It's not 100% transmission, okay? On the other hand, the way we would think of real exchange rate behavior, we would say it affects the incentives for tradables versus non-tradables, right? And that an appreciation reduces the incentive for tradables, pushes up non-tradables. The appreciation part is true. The depreciation part is, frankly, it's a mess. It goes all over the charts. You will not get any more a clear relationship. You get a scatter diagram that is all over the entire place. In other words, it's no longer the case that a depreciation shifts investment incentives in favor of tradables. And once that doesn't hold, then all bets are off, frankly, on what happens to productive capacity. And when that is then compounded by climate change affecting your agricultural supply, by wars, etc., affecting your other types of supply chain aspects, by transport prices increasing dramatically, so you can't export to the places you used to export to, and so on, then in fact, it's that relationship has broken down completely, which is why you find a very large number of developing countries, not just the debt distressed ones, but even countries like India, our exports have not gone up. And in fact, they have declined more than global exports, even though our currencies have depreciated. So, so the world has changed in all kinds of other bad ways as well for us. Isabella, you're absolutely right. Tragically, price controls are more difficult, if not impossible, the more peripheral you are. And even if you're not super peripheral, if you're just middle peripheral like India, it's still a nightmare. And it's for many different reasons, including the internal political economy, but definitely the external thing plays a role. So then what do? We can't do price controls, right? I think, again, if you're addressing the things that you now call, the critical commodities, the strategic things that affect all other prices, let's just stick with, for now, with food and fuel, you would have to do things that affect domestic supply. And that in turn means public procurement and distribution, which is a huge game, and it's a medium-term solution. It's not something you can do tomorrow. You can't simply announce, I'm going to procure everything. There are precedents that work. Drug prices, many developing countries are so much better at controlling drug prices than, let's say, the US. Yeah, of course, US is a very low bar, but Bangladesh, for example, Bangladesh is excellent at controlling drug prices, even though it has been a drug importer and so on. So it is possible to do that, but you can't do it without ensuring adequate domestic supply and public procurement and distribution, which is a much bigger step than just imposing a control. Finally, James, do we have to think about global policy responses to inflation? I would love it if we could. But let me put it this way. If we could start thinking about global cooperation to control inflation, we wouldn't be having this conference, because we wouldn't have had this crazy global inflation, because you would have already prevented the profiteering speculation, exchange rate flows, capital flows, etc. So yeah, I guess. Thanks.
Okay, so I think Jamie Galbraith is eager to raise a point.
Thank you. Thank you, and hello, everybody. It's really great to be able to listen in. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Just a couple of observations, one relating to the mystery that Chandrasekhar, I think, was raising about why the financial authorities and powers would like to have higher interest rates. It might have something to do with the fact that banks have lots of reserves at the central bank, at the Federal Reserve, which pays interest on them at the interest rate. And when the interest rates go up, the checks go up. I can't think of might the fact that they are profit maximizing capitalists might have something to do with this. And the second proposition would be that this also protects the dollar and exports inflation from the United States to every place else in the world. So those are two thoughts as to why this is a policy that central banks will glom onto. The other point, which I just wanted to make in reaction to something Jayati was just saying, and it is that in fact, in the United States, the production of oil is down 1 million barrels a day compared to what it was before the pandemic. And you have a process here where the supply has been rising more slowly than the demand. This is very good for all the barrels that you're producing. So again, that is very easy to translate. That looks like a speculative effect outside the country, and very good for people who are supplying oil. Not so good for people who are buying it, but it, I think, may well have something quite substantial to do with the invasion of private equity into the oil field in the United States, just as the pandemic made those fields very cheap, as the wells were shut down and the cost of acquiring properties was quite low. I haven't read about that in the financial press, but I have read about it in the local press from Carswell, New Mexico, and other well-informed centers of civilization, as you know. So those are the two comments I have. Thank you.
And somebody has a burning need to make a point. I think we're on time and we can end. Oh, let's see, Jerry Epstein point. Okay.
Yeah, so this is also in response to Chandra's question, dilemma about central bank. Well, I don't want to give away all the punchlines in our talk tomorrow, but Aaron and I are presenting a paper tomorrow afternoon with a possible explanation of the conundrum, which is when inflation is low, as it was in the 90s and 2000s, when it had been put on its back, as talking about this and others, then yes, the wealthy benefit from lower interest rates and quantitative easing that creates an asset inflation. However, when inflation goes up, threatening to harm the wealth of creditors and help the real wealth of debtors, then there's a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, yes, when the central bank raises interest rates, that will reduce the nominal value of stocks and bonds and so forth. But on the other hand, if it lowers inflation in time and significantly enough, then in fact, it protects the real wealth of the top 1%, the top 10%. So that's our punchline from our analysis, and you don't have to come tomorrow.